So you're watching the World Ethical Data Forum. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'll be moderating this session. Now, the concept of open source might be one of the most crucial drivers of innovation. It promotes a free exchange of ideas and is responsible for a range of creative, scientific, and technological developments. Let's not forget that the internet itself was built on open source technologies and principles. Recently, many are reasserting the importance of open source as one of the most effective ways to overcome surveillance and censorship from both corporations and from governments. Today, we're joined by the Executive Director of the Tor project, Isabella Fernandez, Chair of London Futurists, David Wood, and Matrix's very own Thibault Martin, to reassert the importance of open source when thinking about digital technologies. So, Isabella, I want to kick off with you. In what way do you think the Tor project is an exemplar of an open source project focused on free software, privacy, and most importantly, human rights?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel and for the question. I think Tor is a good example because um, the design of the onion routing, right? Like it started in a way that was not like necessary with the vision of being open source and to meet the needs of the goals of that design, which it is to provide anonymity. It saw itself like as a project that had to be open source, right? Like it had to be out there for the world to be able to audit, to be able to understand how it works and validate and trust it. I think the type of product that we are building and what we are offering to the user, it is also there's a great chunk of that around trust. And when people hear that we are a free software project, when people hear that we are not for profit organization, people like that creates like a stronger link of trust because it shows the values and shows the motivation behind the project, right? Like it's not a motivation necessary for profit. It's also not a motivation towards secrecy, right? Like it is a motivation that we are transparent and we are about another part of the design is also about decentralization, right? Like, so we do depend on community and we do depend on contribution. So because we are a free software project, we can have more of that, right? Like happen in a way people can contribute to the code and other ways they can contribute also running the code, right? Like, and building the network. I think all of these elements that make it's not just like a project that people trust, but like the security is real, right? Like, and we are thinking about all different categories of security here. Could only be possible because we choose to have the code open and we choose to be a free software project. I think otherwise, some of these elements will be missing.
That's a fascinating idea, Isabella. The idea that open source can engender a certain form of trust. And David Wood, I want to turn to you because beyond London Futurists, you're also known for the Symbian operating system that ran on many Nokia phones. And the Symbian Foundation has similarities to the Tor Foundation, doesn't it? Could you share some of those with us?
Absolutely. So the work I did with the Symbian operating system for smartphones in the late 1990s, the 2000s, and the early 2010s was successful for a while and then very unsuccessful. And some of the reasons for the ultimate lack of success was that we didn't design in open source principles from the very beginning. Instead, we had our own reasons to keep some of the source code secret, we thought. We contracted with suppliers who also wanted to keep their source code secret because they could charge money for it. And when the time came when we thought, actually, there are more advantages to being open source than to be closed source, the kinds of things that Isabella pointed to, more trust, it turns out that converting 40 million lines of code from closed to open was actually problematic. Well, one thing is some of our programmers had used bad language, profanities in the comments. This is here because of this terrible beep, beep, beep requirement. Well, that wasn't too bad. We managed to track down most of the profanities, but then there was references to secret projects from our licensees, our phone manufacturers, again, that had been put in the comments. We have to do it like this because it wasn't Nokia maybe, but one of our other customers needs a special feature. So we had to take out these comments, There was also the concern that if we opened up the code, we would be risking patent violation suits, because there was at the time a lot of an industry of patent trolls, I might call them, people who scanned over patent code. And the more code we exposed, the more risk there was that somebody would say, you're violating our patent. And although we didn't think we were doing any such thing, there was a reservation there. And then we'll come to possibly the most serious point, the risk of exposing security flaws. We thought our software was pretty secure, but if more people could look at it, perhaps there would have been some bad assumptions in some of these 40 million lines of code, which wasn't. So that took us a long time to sort out. Too long, in fact. And by the time we'd made this conversion, 2 other operating systems had come to dominate. One being open source, namely Android from Google. One, as it turns out, largely being closed source, although with many open source elements. So my takeaway from this is it's not just enough to go through this letter of open source. There's a spirit, there's a set of values, there's a set of ideas. And if you don't have them, then just open source won't be magic. It won't be a panacea.
Well, the spirit and the values of open source, they're embedded in technologies like Matrix that the World Ethical Data Forum is using to bring you this content right now. And somebody else who's using Matrix is Thibault. And Thibault, I just want to ask you, why was it so important for you when you were making Element to make it fully open sourced? But also for our audience, what is Matrix and how have open source principles helped make something like Element an enjoyable user experience?
Yeah, so we have been touching on many interesting points, and thank you very much for having us in this panel. I think it was very important for us to be open source because open source is a prerequisite, but not enough alone, to battle against surveillance, censorship, and to have better security overall. It's a technical solution in a way, but surveillance and censorship are systemic issues. Sorry. Surveillance and censorship are systemic issues that you cannot find with technical solutions alone. So, for example, security is better in open source because it's just regular code that is open. But because it is open, most of the people can audit it and report it. So you need to make it more appealing to for security researchers to report the security issues to you than to other people or to exploit those vulnerabilities they find. So this is what open source allows. But open source was also a way to fight against surveillance and centralization. Centralization is the root problem that leads to surveillance in general. And I've not been talking about what Matrix is. So yes, Matrix is the sort of meeting between email, instant messaging, and encryption. So Matrix is a decentralized federated messenger. It's email, but instantaneous and secure out of the box.
So how does that compare with something like Telegram, Teeb? Naively, if you'd asked me to say something which is secure and messaging, I would have said, hey, doesn't Telegram fit the bill? Why do we need Matrix as well? So
Telegram is interesting because by default, it's not end-to-end encrypted, or it wasn't. So it supports a form of encryption, but the user interface can be a little deceiving. You may trust them when actually, in fact, it's not end-to-end encrypted. So that's one thing. The user experience matters, and you need to really earn and deserve the user's trust. But there's also another fact, which is Telegram is centralized. So Telegram is a single service, and every single Telegram user is using Telegram services, where Matrix is a protocol, and everybody can host their own provider of Matrix. Think of your own email server, for example. You can decide to federate with the rest of the world, so you can be part of the federation and open your server to talk with other people. But you can also decide not to, if you want to have it just for your company, or to federate only with a few people, a few companies, a few other organizations, for example.
So to zoom out for a second, I just wondered, perhaps Isabella and David, could you explain to us what are some of the, where are we, I guess, in terms of the war between something like open innovation and proprietary standards? Is there still a tension there, or does one allow for the other to exist?
I
Isabella,
think,
perhaps first.
yes, I think if you ask this question, like everybody's gonna have a different answer because of the context where people are at, right? Like, and what they have lived in the free software movement and the world. So because I'm Brazilian, I come from being involved with free software since the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, we saw for many years an adoption and investment from the government on that, right? Like on having free software being on schools, being part of our culture making, right? Like what communities would use to produce culture, right? Like music and other things with videos and so forth. So I saw like an adoption and a use of free software. I was part of that. I work on those projects, and in a way that was very powerful, where you can talk about the money, right? Like, and who is controlling all these things. And I feel like the design, right? Like that Thibault was explaining for metrics, right? Like where you can run your own server, you can choose to be part of things. So like at the end of the day, that model, that way of doing technology, of building technology, I think that provided very interesting things. One of them, it is that, right? Like it is free software. Anyone can run it. Anyone can own it. You know, like it's not like you are not dependent on a centralized service to do it, right? Like that creates, you know, breaks away from the monopoly, right? Like it breaks, it creates more diversity. It actually creates for economy, enables more small business, right? Like providing service and things like that. And even in the government sense, like we stop like giving millions of dollars to a license, and that money start going to the workers, to events, you know, like for instance, a Python conference or something like that, where they will be getting the skills more sharp, right? Like instead of just upgrading a software, you're actually contributing to the code, you're actually exercising those skills that you went to school for, you know, and enable like a huge transformation. That's what I'm trying to show, right? Like it enabled a huge transformation on the mindset, on how people were thinking about things and thinking about technology. So unfortunately, right, like that was a momentum. And I think in life, in society, we go through cycles, right? Like, and now we are in a different cycle in Brazil. But I feel that that gives you an example. And I'm not just talking about one country, because at that time, a lot of other countries were, you know, starting to do similar projects and similar adoptions and similar takeaways of, you can see examples in Europe as well, you know, like in other places in Latin America, takeaways of like, having like that ownership over technology, not a dependency on a monopoly, right? Like, so I feel like, to answer your question about today, I think that is a catch up. I think that was a generation here that it is trying to figure out ways to go back to that time and needs to understand that that time did exist at some point. And so I think that is that we are in the middle of this catch up, because there was in a moment where, unfortunately, right, like the cycle reverse, right? Like, so the monopoly, the proprietary software kind of like gain more space, right, in a certain way. However, the free software is not behind in any way. We have very advanced technologies. A lot of what the monopoly and the proprietary software is doing depends on some of the technology that we are building. I think what is missing here, it is, and I said that to like a bunch of students early this year in Brazil. I was like, you know, like it's missing is that a little bit of like good rebellion, right? Like not accepting the industry and the technology that it is around you as it is, as the way it is, right? Like, and that crusade of like providing all the types of example. And that's a little bit of the spirit of Tor. Like we're not like, for instance, in this game to own the market of browsers. We are here to show that it's possible. You know, like you can use and have the technology in a different way, respecting other like rights and with other type of motivation. And people catch up. You see other browsers now providing some of the protections that we've been providing for over a decade. You know, like, so I think my answer to you, it is possible to regain that momentum. I think people want to gain that momentum. I think having debates like this, panel like this, is about that, right? Like it's about incentivizing people to gain that momentum. So we need to invest on it. It's not just gonna come if we're just sitting doing your thing, like we need to actually go after it and invest it.
So, David, do you think the world is becoming more open or more proprietary? And with some of the new innovations around the corner, such as IoT and AI, do you think open source has something to contribute there?
Well, there's two slightly different things. There's open source versus closed source, and then there's open standards versus proprietary standards. And it's possible to have, for example, adoption of open standards, but still implement them in closed source. So it's a slightly complicated scenario. I'm a big fan of open standards. I'm a big fan of not having everybody do their own thing. It's a Tower of Babel, literally, if everybody speaks their own language rather than conversing. But equally, I think it's very important that we support diversity. I don't just mean diversity of ethnicity, I mean diversity of ideas for how to develop standards further. And sometimes you can have an idea to improve a standard and you can talk to the people who own the standard and you can convince them. But sometimes, for whatever reason, the people running the old standard are preoccupied by other things and they don't see the same user cases as you do. So thank goodness you can fork. That's one of the brilliant features of the technology world in which we live in, that it's possible to start from something and move it in a different direction. And that introduces a bit of chaos, a bit of difficulty, but as a result, we can in due course figure out what to do next. And I would go a bit further. I think it may sometimes be appropriate for at least some code for a while to be not shared completely openly, because there may be some concerns about, as I was roughly saying before, that if the code is known, it might be possible to engineer a particular cunning attack on it. Now, if the code had been completely architected from the beginning with the best intentions, perhaps this wouldn't be the case, but having at least some code not in the open might have some advantages. If there are some health and safety features, might call them, or some features to ensure software is used safely, if somebody else comes along and forks that, takes out the health and safety checks, you might end up with an algorithm that is failing in some way. It might be more biased, for example. We all know the risks of algorithms that are biased. Somebody might put in checks in their software to ensure there's no bias. That might slow things down, and somebody else will say, let's get rid of this. And so I think it's quite complicated, but the way to approach it is to discuss what are the requirements, what are the issues, what could go wrong, and what could go wonderfully right.
Well, Tib, one of the implied elements in the title of this session is that open source, in some way, shape, or form, can help overcome more of the worrying trends related to something like surveillance. So, what is your sort of worldview when it comes to how you look at something like surveillance, and where you think something like open source fits in there?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like just to add something to
Please.
what our guests have said. I think one way to put it is that open source is about making it not just your problem. So it's about sharing the problems, it's about sharing the issues, it's about sharing the experience, and in the end, it's about getting battle-tested software. And you get software that has been through battles you have not been through. So you end up with having more secure software. You end up with having software that is answering to problems you may not already have had. But open source is just regular code that happens to be publicly accessible. So it's also subjected to bit rotting, what we call bit rotting in the industry. If you leave some code untouched, it's going to be flaky and insecure. It's not going to meet the standards of people. So when using open source as an organization, you also want to contribute to the sustainability of the project, to make sure the maintenance burden of the project, the fact that the project offers you to share the maintenance burden with others, and you want to make it sure that it's not going to be your problem alone because the project disappeared. To talk about surveillance and our take on that, I think it's important to have two approaches. Open source basically allows an organization, whether it's formal or informal, to say, this is the software we're providing, and you can see what it does. And it's important to separate two cases: software that runs locally and services. Services basically is everything you pay someone to run for you, whether you pay them with your money, with your data, or why not your taxes. Those are rarely free. And there's always a bit of trust in that. When you are using services, you need to trust the provider to actually run the software they're telling you they are running. But you also need to trust the provider to listen to, not to listen to everything you are doing on their services. So there are technical solutions to prevent that to an extent. In the case of Matrix, I've been talking about end-to-end encryption, so it might sound a little technical. But in fact, it's very simple. It basically means that the messages you are exchanging with someone on Matrix are transported in sealed chests, and only you and your peer have the key to open them. But to be able to transport the chest, your service provider still needs to know the address where the message needs to be delivered, where the chest needs to be delivered. So it can be sensitive information or not, depending on your threat model. And we think open source is a good way to help you shaping a threat model that fits you. It's not a one size fits all. You always need to define what you want to protect against and what you don't care about. You always need to make trade-offs. So this is what open source allows. And in terms of combating surveillance, open source allows reproducibility, I'd say. There is another aspect we are very interested in Matrix, which is federation. The fact that everybody can get their little island where they are in control of what's happening, and they can decide to open up or not, if they don't want, with other providers.
Well, Isabella, this approach, it had real world impact in many ways. And you've gone as far as advocating that open source allows us to have, in many ways, human rights. So could you just give us some examples of how open source technology has enabled access to human rights across the world through a multitude of projects using things like the Tor network?
Yes, I feel like one example, right, like we are living it right now, which it is the uprising in Iran that is happening. And there is a lot of censorship and control, right, like surveillance of the internet. And the people in Iran are using Tor to bypass that. And people are using other projects as well. I think there are projects that work really well in moments where there's a complete internet shutdown. That is a project called Briar that allows people to continue communication in those moments. And with encryption and with security, I feel like great part of our lives today, it's online, right? Like that is a lot of people who are still not connected, but like most of the people we saw with the pandemic, the dependencies on like just like civic rights, right? Like have access to information about healthcare, you know, like education, right? Like when you're isolated, right? Like civic rights are dependable on depending on the situation that we are online. And I think that all the things that are related to it, being a student, you know, taking the classes from home, you know, like being me booking my vaccine for COVID, whatever that is, it needs to be protected. It is my right and it needs to be protected. And I think that's why not just open source, but encryption going along with it, it is very important in the world that we live today. I think as people are building any type of security and messing, like dealing with other people's data, they need to take that very seriously because it is direct connected with our rights. Like sometimes when we're talking about being online, people just think about, right, like, which is not just, it's a big deal, but think about the right for privacy, the right for access to information, freedom of expression, and those are human rights, right? Like, but there's a lot going on in the world that the internet is part of it, that is related to all the other civic rights that people have in society. And I think we need to be really reflecting about the connections here, because sometimes, right, like Tor allows people to be completely anonymous online. And sometimes I do get questions about like, your technology is allowing that. Don't you feel like it's dangerous? And I say to people that like, actually the most important pillar of democracy is around anonymity. Is when people are allowed, like when people are voting, they're anonymous. Like nobody knows your vote, only you, you know, like, so I feel like actually the UN says that too, right? Like for you to be able to exercise your civic rights, anonymity is a huge part of that. And being online when you're doing those things it is a huge part of life today. So I think having technology that allows you to be anonymous online, having technology that, like Thibault was saying, end-to-end encryption, right? Like providing that level of security of the information that you are sharing or you are accessing is extremely important to make sure that we are protecting our rights online and protecting when people are fighting for rights, right? Like as well. So it is direct connected. There is no way anything today, and I'm not even talking about communication or anything, like your right to access your bank account, it needs to be protected, right? It is about, right? Like it is something that anything that you do online nowadays needs to come with it. I think I just want to highlight, if possible, right? Like in October, we have the Global Encryption Day. And one of the campaigns this year is about all the messaging apps, all the DMs, right? Like it's called Make DMs Safe. But it's about bringing end-to-end encryption to all of it, right? Like it needs to be that way. Like I think the world cannot, like we cannot tolerate having technology that like being built without taking all those things into account.
Well, David, I want to turn to you for some more examples of where you've seen cultural impact caused by open source technologies, because it feels like for every example of maybe a corporate or closed platform or system, there's a open source alternative. But often there's challenges with those open source alternatives, isn't there? Sometimes they offer multiple advantages, but it's hard to get the critical mass of people to realize those advantages of certain open source ways of doing things.
Well, the classic example is Facebook versus non-proprietary social network systems. Facebook is incredibly successful, incredibly sticky. People periodically saying, right, I'm out of here. I'm not having anything more to do with this. And then a few months later, they come back. Not always, but they do. So those of us who wish that there was a more open system with more transparency into the governance systems aren't finding it easy to see this change. There is a weight of numbers there. And Facebook is also important on the kind of issues that Isabela was mentioning. This is not just first world problems. This is life or death issues. The issues in Iran should make us realize this is not just a geeky discussion about which kind of brackets to use and which kinds of protocols maybe are slightly better. People in Iran risk being killed if their secret communications are intercepted. And it's been that case for a while. If you secretly are an atheist, if you secretly are thought to blaspheme, if you are of a sexual outlook that is not approved by the state, and this you might try to keep hidden, but if it's revealed, it's terrible. So this is a live issue, a vital issue in Iran. It's something similar is going on in Ukraine. It looks like some of the Russian military communications have been intercepted, and I'm personally quite glad that's the case, but it's still a very messy situation. And so these issues are real. And with Facebook, what's the worst that Facebook has done? Well, we've seen a case in the UK recently, a teenager, Molly Russell, who with various bits of social media was driven down a long spiral of depression. And that's bad. But there's nothing like as bad as what happened to the people in the Rohingya massacre in Burma, Myanmar, where Facebook had a system with very few Burmese speaking moderators. And as a result, the hate discussion, the stereotypes about Muslim populations inflamed huge violence among the non-Muslims. And people were raped, people were hit with sticks, thrown into fires, and by some counts, tens of thousands of people were killed. And the Rohingya have got, understandably, a large court case pending. So these are critical issues, and we have to have a grown-up discussion. I think Facebook's trying, at least with their moderation panel, but they're struggling, and we need to keep them very much on their toes, and we need to keep these issues alive.
Well, but keeping those things alive, it certainly feels like the stakes are extremely high here. And looking around at some of the people that you work with and collaborate with, do you think the principles of open source, do you think they're still alive within the developer and the tech community? And if not, or if so, how do you encourage those principles and those sort of communities?
So how do we incentivize people to be, I would say, upstream first, and I explain what upstream is. Basically, from an economic perspective, it makes sense. We said that earlier, it's just about sharing burdens. So if you are using an open source product, basically you want to make, you want to solve one of your problems, and you want to make it not only your problem, but also someone else's problem. So this is how we incentivize our customers to contribute to the common good that Matrix is. And by making it not only their problem, they are sharing the burden, they are sharing the costs. If you don't mind, I would like to touch on moderation, because we had a very interesting conversation about Facebook and moderation, and the lack of moderation and the very real life impact it does have. Sometimes people associate moderation with censorship or with the lack of free speech. And I think that's not true at all. Moderation essentially is about removing the content and behavior that are not acceptable. The real question is who decides what is acceptable and what is not. In practice, in the case of Matrix, and I'm going to sound like a broken clock, but this is decentralization, which makes the real power and advantage of it. In Matrix, we have the matrix.org server provided by the matrix.org Foundation that gives you a matrix.org account for free. And the matrix.org Foundation is UK based. We obey the UK rules. We have our own moral values and rules. And you need to respect these rules to keep using your account. And if you break them, your account is going to be suspended and your content is going to be removed. But the matrix.org Foundation cannot and should not be able to remove content from a Matrix server that we are not running. As tempting as it might be, it would be way too much power concentrated in single hands. And if large company making millions, if not billions, like Facebook struggle with that, how can we expect an open source project to do it? The moderation needs to be in the hands of the local communities. It needs to happen close to where the issues are, to where the people are. So we are working hard to strengthen the moderation on matrix.org, but we are also working hard on providing tools to empower the local communities using Matrix for their use case in their context, to be empowered to apply their moderation.
So,
Keith,
David,
do you have any considerations about people masquerading as locals? Because this happened in many Facebook groups in 2016. There were people from overseas countries pretending to be Florida cheerleaders, pretending to be Florida supporters of racism, pretending to be supporters of Bernie Sanders in there. And not only might they have been posting things, but they might have been influencing any discussions on moderation. So how do you actually have these decentralized discussions without opening yourself up for being hijacked by well-financed, well-organized dooms players?
This, I believe, is exactly a problem that cannot be solved with technology. And I think we should not be providing tools. We can think about tools to identify patterns. For example, if we have a single account which is spamming the same thing over and over in various channels, we can still think that this is somebody with an agenda that is trying to influence something, and that it is not a genuine human behavior. We can have these sort of tools, but we cannot enforce decisions automatically based on tools. We still need to keep a human in the loop. It's very important for moderation.
Well, David, you have this concept, trustable monitoring. Would that be a solution to this moderation issue? And firstly, could you explain what that is?
It's a controversial idea. It's the idea that we can't just not look. We have to look because there are a number of people in the world who have very bad motivations. They have often been hurt in the world. They have had miserable experiences, or they perceive to have miserable experiences. And what can they do? Well, in the olden days, they might, they could have a local bomb. They could kill a few people. But if they can get access to what we sometimes call weapons of mass destruction, if they can get their hands on bioweapons, or if they can create some very nasty malware, ransomware, whatever, then I think it's in all of our interest to try and somehow spot this. And I'm not sure what the best way is to do it, but we can't just say, let's trust everybody. I think maybe 99% of the world could be trusted in that way, but you only need a small number. An example, in Japan, there was this group Om Shirin Ryukyo, which was a weird combination of Buddhist, Shinto, and Christian apocalypticism. And they released sarin gas on the Tokyo Underground. They were interested in doing worse things. They tried to assemble even more powerful weapons, and thankfully they weren't competent enough in that case to do it. But as time moves on, there are more and more people who might be able to assemble and trigger something very nasty. And so it's an issue we have to face, which is, can we have a system to monitor without putting too much power in the monitor? So we have to have watchers of the watchers, and we have to have various levels of approval. It's a little bit like, only a little bit like, there are black box recorders in aeroplanes. And at first, when this was proposed 30, 40 years ago, some of the unions were worried, hey, we're going to be overheard in our chatting. We won't be free to have our normal banter. But it turns out it's actually a good idea to monitor what's said in the cabin at all times, because whenever there's a crash, and they don't happen often, they happen very rarely, but whenever there is a crash, we look at the data and we track back and we see how we can avoid that happening in the future. So that's an example of trustable monitoring, and I think we need to explore that further.
Watching the watchers. So, Isabela, what's your response to something like that?
Yeah, I think it will never end, right? Like it's kind of like those little cartoons that like you get like because at the end of the day, right? Like I can see the black box for the airplane example work for that example, but I would not trust a black box that is keeping a record of all my private conversation just in case one day someone needs to look into it, for whatever. I feel like when we say end-to-end encryption on all the messaging apps, it is to have end-to-end encryption, and those conversations need to be private, because the goal of those type of technologies is about, right, like being a private, like I'm talking about direct messaging. I'm talking about something like Telegram. I'm not talking about one-to-many. I'm talking about private conversations. It's not the model of like amplification that some other platforms, kind of like the public side of those platforms like Twitter does, right? Like that's what I'm talking about. So I feel like that, like even in the case of Tor, we're not hosting anything, we're providing the infrastructure. But we have no control on what people do with the technology, right? Yes, in the real world, that will be impossible to create anything that might be used for something bad. I cannot create a table, I cannot create a cup, I cannot create one thing in this world that eventually could not, I can completely control. I think the questions about moderation, right? Like for the public content and all of that, I go towards the example that Thibault was giving about the local community. I think when David brought up the question, like, okay, when a bad actor infiltrates those groups, right? What happens? I think that's part of the culture of teaching the local community, right? Like on how to be empowered, and how to have governance of the group. I think we can take a lot of lessons from Wikipedia on that, right? Like they do have a very robust global structure like this, I think if private companies would like to, they would have the money to invest in such it is fine that Facebook is giving one governance body that can do, but like this is like a tip in like a 1 grain of sand in this whole world of Facebook. Like they could invest in multiple groups. They're smaller, they're more local, that they understand the local context, that would have more bandwidth, right? Like to deal with it. I think what companies have money to invest in future projects, right? Like to solve or envision what would be the world in 5-10 years from now. And they have millions of dollars to be doing those projects for multiple years until we get out to the world. It is about priority, right? Like you investing on that, or you investing on like, how can we continue to have platforms like this, but mitigate, right? Like the moderation problem. And can I invest on actually having local groups like that? Can I put part of my money into it, like off net profit, into paying staff to expand in that way? So it's about prioritization, right? Like
Mm.
at the end of the day, I just want to finish by saying that the problems that we are facing with in the context that we're living today are beyond just technology. Like it goes outside of the tech world of the line of code that is happening, right? Like, so we need to think of solutions that are holistic in that way and not just like one silver bullet that like, this is how we're going to fix it.
Hmm. Well, I want to spend our last few moments together and just ask a question about looking into the future at how open source technologies could be used, and specifically how they could contribute to things like IoT or even AI technologies. So, David, obviously, I'm going to hand that one to you and ask you, how do you think open source might be used in the near future?
So AI is going to take more and more parts of our lives. As a futurist, this is one of the predictions I feel strongest about. Whatever people think AI might be doing in the future, sooner or later, it probably will be doing more sooner or later. And what does that mean? Well, it means, amongst other things, cleverer malware, cleverer software worming its way onto our Internet of Things devices. There's already lots of cheap devices where corners were cut in terms of security, which had default passwords or which could be hacked in other ways. Some of that security has been beefed up now, and some anti-malware solutions detect against signatures. If software's got this signature, then it's bad. The next generation of malware avoids having particular signatures. It endlessly recreates itself. So the next generation of anti-malware spots behaviors, and then the next generation of malware tries to hide its behavior. It looks cool and cuddly and correct until it suddenly has got you in its trust and it stabs you. So I think there's going to be a lot of things moving there, and it's even more of a reason why we should have these discussions beforehand. Consider the technology, but absolutely, as Isabela says, we have to consider the human dimensions of this too, including not supporting people cutting corners in the costs of these devices. We have to actually prioritize devices which are proven to have a higher quality of safety and security and robustness, resilience, auditability.
Well, Tib, I'm going to ask you that question as well. What sorts of contributions do you think open source might make to creating our sort of future of technology?
It could be very great one or terrible one. We have been talking about AI, for example, and AI can be built on open source. The thing we like with open source is you can take the code, you can run it, and you're going to have the same results. With AI, it's not exactly that. You need to have training sets. If you have a different training set with the same code that is open source, you're going to have different results. You're going to have different bias. So open source could be used to create fantastic things. For example, IoT is using Matrix, for example, to transport safely messages without everybody listening to what is happening, because not everybody needs to know what the temperature is in your house, for example. But we can build terrible things like AI that produces terrible results if we are not careful about what we are producing. So I would summarize my thoughts as open source is a great tool, but it needs to be monitored, and let's not forget the human.
And Isabela, I finally want to turn to you about some of the thoughts that you have about some of the exciting possibilities for things like open source and the Tor project.
Yes, I think open source, like I go a lot with, right, like the future depends on us, right? Like we can have a very passive, be very passive towards the future and let the AI with a huge bias being applied on like facial recognition in the street and get, like minorities arrested for no reason. Or we can be active on this feature, like and push for different applications of the technology that we see around us. And that is where I feel like, open source can play, right? Like a great play, great deal in this game regarding points that we raised it here that we believe to be important, right? Like encryption is one of those, right? Like that we see open source protocols for encryption being adopted, right? Like in applications that are used by billions of people, right? Like, so that is important. We see, we spoke about federalization, decentralization, and that also goes together with another word that is difficult for me to pronounce, interoperability. But there you go, I did it. But all of that, right, like it's part of the word that we are seeing regarding less centralization on monopolies, on the hands that like on places that are governed by a small group of people that people don't know motivations of decisions. So like it's breaking out of that, right? Like promoting more services, small business, and people doing all of that, like not being just like one big company doing it all. So I feel like if we want the future, free software definitely can play a huge deal on this, because it will be the technology that glue all these little ones together that builds the big thing, right? Like instead of me trusting one organization to do the big thing, like everybody can do it and we can glue it together, because the connection can be done with the free software, and we can play a huge part of that, right? Like, and that can evolve with everybody who's benefiting from it contributing back to it, right? Like, so I think yes, for the future, like depends on the future you want. If we want that type of feature, it can play a great deal into it, and help us solve those types of problems together. Yeah.
Well, it certainly feels like open source principles and open source technologies still have such an important role to play. And on that note, as always, the conversation continues on Twitter using the hashtag WEDF2022. And you can follow all of our participants using the links provided in the digital program. My name is Luke Robert Mason. And on that note, I want to thank all of our panelists for their incredible contributions today. Thank you to all of you.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.